Hello, I'm Phil Svitek, 360 Creative Coach, and welcome to the latest edition of my vlog, where we're going to go pretty deep on a lot of various things, right? The title of the episode is Making Sense of War, Funerals, and Art. So it's going to get pretty heavy pretty quickly. And, there's a quote from Vladimir Lenin that goes, "There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen." And last week certainly feels like that. So I'm going to try to unpack it as best as I can. And, normally I say, hey, subscribe and things like that. I was going to do that. Feels kind of weird. And that's going to be the general tone of this episode. It's going to feel a little bit awkward at times. I don't have necessarily all the right words of what to say, how to say it, but I'm going to try to say it. And hopefully through the context of how I talk about it, you will understand my intent. And for a long time, I thought, okay, maybe I should take this week off and shouldn't do anything and really process the state of the world. But I think I have something to say. And, I think that was the big thing. I didn't want to just do stuff for the sake of doing them. I really wanted to do something that added to the conversation. If I couldn't add anything to the conversation, I wanted to just do something because it's just noise on top of noise. And, I think a lot of ways our world in general, through the capitalist underpinnings, is, more. Enough is never enough type of thing, right? But I've gotten to a place where I think I can talk about some of the stuff that may be of benefit, right? So, obviously the big thing is, the war that's broken out in Ukraine. And for me, this hits home because Ukraine borders Slovakia, where I'm essentially from. That's where my parents are from. And, I spent summers there. I didn't grow up there necessarily, but I went to first grade there. The rest of my family is there. And so this is something that hits close to home. And, not that all people are the same at all, and certainly not even within countries, but if you're going to lump anything together, I think I kind of have a decent enough viewpoint into the Eastern European mentality and all that. And yeah, so I'm going to try to speak to it in the best way that I can. And, one of the things that I want to talk about first off is that how this gets covered. This is a huge atrocity. No one wants this, right? Except maybe Putin, I guess, or whatever. But, wars in general, to act like that this is something new, is a little bit, I'm not quite sure of the word, is a little bit ignorant, for lack of a better term, simply because wars, there's that notion that, I can't believe I'm living through a war in my lifetime. And regardless of your age, ultimately, you personally might not have been involved in a war, but the world has been at war during your lifetime. I mean, Yemen right now is facing a huge, huge crisis. Afghanistan, just because we left, doesn't mean it's on stable ground. So one of the things that we have to be careful of is how we approach speaking about this. Because, yes, I think there's a lot at stake here. But in terms of coverage, certainly the media picks and chooses humanitarian issues, and I'll lump this in with that, of how we go about it. And that's not good, right? It's something that Noam Chomsky writes a lot about. I think, so I'm holding up a few of his books. If you're on audio, there's Hopes and Prospects, and there's Who Rules the World. He's got amazing books. But he talks a lot about this in terms of what gets chosen and how that helps those in power, in terms of what gets covered and what gets ignored. And certainly Yemen right now is being ignored for the simple fact that the U.S. has a hand in it. That's not so glamorous, let's say. And so this opens up a core tenet of what I'm speaking about today, is that two things and multiple things can be true at the same time. The war in Ukraine is bad, but we also can't say that it's the only war or that it's the worst war or whatever, because there is a lot of stuff happening. The other negative aspect that's tough to look at is that even in this, right, the idea of peace is very noble, and many people want that and espouse it, which is great. And yet, those same people are turning down black people from being able to leave Ukraine for the simple fact that they're black. So it's racism, of course, but I'm almost tired of that word, because what it ultimately is you're just devaluing human life, right? And of course, that's the literal definition of like racism. But I just want to term it differently, to put it more up front, and say like, yeah, that is what is happening. And especially to people who talk about all lives matter, then it's like, yes, all lives matter. Therefore, Black lives matter, right? And so they have as much right to flee, war zone as anybody else. And you have to, if you want peace on this earth, that has to be a part of it. I don't know another way around it. And that's something that we have to really grapple with. Speaking of Noam Chomsky, I often, in my circle of people that I know, whether very close or just, somewhat or slightly indirectly, they read tons of self-help books. And I get down on this because the point of reading those books is to be able and willing to serve, to be in service of something greater than yourself. And what situation than this counts? And yet, so many of us hide behind that and allow narcissistic tendencies to shine through of, well, it's self-care. And it's not to say that self-care isn't important right now. I think one of the things that gets hard to grapple with for people is this idea of privilege, because, let's face it, the fact that we're not in a war zone is privilege, right? But rather than berate yourself for that, it's how are you going to use your privilege to benefit others, right? And it doesn't mean you have to be a martyr nonstop, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later and expand upon that. And yes, there is the idea of taking care of yourself, because until we achieve inner peace, there can never be world peace, as so many of us said. And yeah, there's that aspect of it. And this, I've been talking with a lot of people in my life, and one of the things is you have to take a step back. And that's what self-help is supposed to allow you to do, is to think clear-headed, right? And that's why I'm able to do this, is because, not that I'm this enlightened one, but I've done enough work where I can process this stuff and compartmentalize it in a multitude of ways in a way that's not destructive, or at least as I define it, as destructive. And so, I look at history and, I ask myself, okay, what about this seems opportune from the Russian perspective, in terms of Putin? Well, there's midterms of elections happening in America this year. There's elections happening within Europe this year. So the state of the world being is, that if you're ever going to go kind of for this was an opportune time because of the destabilization of things. Certainly, going on year 3 of the pandemic. So in that sense, it kind of makes sense, right? That's kind of as far as like the question of why now and why this. Obviously, there's a lot more to it than that, but that seems a good idea as any if you're going to kind of go for that. Now, as far as the response and things like that, obviously that's, there's at the time of this recording, there's been sanctions and things of that nature, and so forth. And what we have to hope for is that the escalation, because, the sanctions are crumbling the Russian economy, then what's the retaliation, right? And that's a big aspect of it, is we have to start to figure out ways of de-escalating this. And our world in general, even within our own country, America, emotions are just so heightened. And we just stack brick upon brick rather than letting the air out of the tire, so to speak. And then there's this notion, well, how long is this really going to go on? War is not quick. Even like the U.S. in terms of Baghdad, it took 3 weeks to occupy Baghdad. At least I'm pretty sure that's how it is, or was rather. And as far as resolution, I don't know how quickly this resolves. War is not quick. So there's that. And there's another quote, this idea that war is hell. Well, war is not hell. War is war and hell is hell. And why do I say that? Well, who goes to hell? Right? Whether, just regardless of what your, religion is. The idea that is common to various religions is that sinners go to hell, right? People who are quote unquote evil or just do bad things. But who's involved in wars? Most of the people right now being affected are not sinners in by that definition of that term, right? And that's the problem with war. So, these sanctions and so forth, they're hurting a lot of people. And yes, I'm not arguing against them. I'm just saying this is a fact. And it's interesting, in 1984, one of the aspects that most people forget about that book, because people from both sides, all sides, every side you can imagine, love to quote George Orwell, and specifically 1984. And in 1984, one of the things that George Orwell so brilliantly puts, I don't know the quote necessarily, but the idea that whatever is the party not in power, they can point criticism and, say, if we can do X, Y, and Z, and that will solve everything. And then they go into power, positions of power, and essentially just mimic the previous people in power. Not quite verbatim, but in that way. And that's why when you look at throughout all of human history, I kind of started looking at it. And yeah, just war is as human as anything else, unfortunately. So how do we break out of that pattern? Well, again, there can never be world peace without inner peace. And it's not to say that the world isn't better now than it was before, but at the same time, things have escalated because now we can blow ourselves up with nukes of, 10 times over at least. And so when I talk about cause and reaction, cause and effect, sanctions, they have an effect. And, how people will view them and so forth and what that leads to in generations to come, I don't know. And obviously, we have to deal with the crisis at hand, so it's hard to think long-term of 10, 20, 30 years. But still, if we want to break the patterns that continue to get us here to war, I think it's worth considering. And in that way, I do have empathy for past generations. Because when you really consider what every generation has been through, it's no wonder many of us are even just standing and whatnot. We go through so much trauma just by being, And so we have to be able to process that, and that's hard. And that's why I understand that it is so easy to just stick your head in a self-help book and just work on yourself and try to close out the world. Fortunately, that's not how it works. Which leads me to this idea of, a lot of people, especially initially, some still now, are praying for peace. And that's a noble thought, we would call that a noble thought. But, when I look at what I do, I really preach to the choir. Because A, that's who listens. And B, because I expect high standards of myself and of people that say they are like-minded in that way. And one of the ways that we have to consider breaking out of these patterns is through action. Whether we look at school shootings, whether we look at, wealth inequality and so forth, whatever sort of, domestic or international grievance you want to look to, we're quick to say, thoughts and prayers. And again, that's noble, but it must be followed by action. I think there are many instances where a lot of people say, how do we keep happening? How do we keep getting to this place? And it's because of inaction. We have to break patterns and do something. And there is stuff that you can do. I talked about the idea of your privilege is a means for you to be able to help. So how can you help? Of course, there's financial support, right? UkraineNow.org is an organization that you can donate money to and help Ukraine at this particular moment in time. But it's not the only way, right? Of course, calling your representatives, protesting, staying educated, amplifying correct and verifiable news sources so people are informed. All these sort of various things. And the fact of it is that activism, just like being an artist or being an entrepreneur, is really quite unglamorous. It's doing a myriad of small and unsexy things over and over on a daily basis. And that's why I talked about that this isn't going to be a quick thing. I think a lot of people, I get it. You know, their head is reeling, their hearts are shattered, and they want this resolved. Historically, that doesn't just happen. You know, even if just letting the course of nature, let's say, like if the course of nature was that this is going to get resolved, you know, and that's what it's destined to do, it doesn't happen quickly. It just doesn't. Historically, it's not happened quickly. And in many, like, for many countries, this is like the number one, if not, you know, top 3 priority. And in spite of that, I don't see this like getting resolved within a day or two. It might be weeks. It might be months. I hope not. But hope is not a strategy. And so part of that is understanding that, right? And being in it for the long haul, like all things. So, you know, that's kind of what it is. And that's why I do try to study, you know, these are cycles, these are patterns, and that's why I try to study history to understand what those patterns are, so I can have some foresight and be able to navigate. And that's why I recommend Noam Chomsky in particular about this, because I think not only does he recognize the patterns, but he shows the things that, you know, most books don't. You know, most media coverage doesn't. So that's a big aspect of it. So that's my thoughts on that, you know, and I'm not going to get into like the news aspects of it because I'm not a journalist. You know, I think I'm encouraged by certain things, you know, the fact that Ukraine is still standing and so forth, and the capital, that's a positive sign. The fact that there's people protesting in Russia in large droves, knowing what the cost to them is, because, you know, they're going to jail and could worse, right? That's encouraging. The movement to stop and create action within European cities, I think in particular Berlin and Prague, that's encouraging. So there's a lot of stuff happening. That shows positivity, and there are talks happening. I don't have all, you know, the hour by hour, and I'm not trying to date this in that way either. But, you know, you want that, but it doesn't mean that just, you know, that those positives you have to take with also the negatives and figure out, okay, where are we at realistically on things? And I just don't think that it's going to be a quick resolve. And as I said, it doesn't negate the other aspects still happening in places like a Yemen, right? So just stuff to consider, ultimately. And I hope I at least gave you a calm way to consider some of these things. So, you know, there's all that I've been making sense of, and I imagine you probably have been too. And, you know, while still trying to go about my day-to-day in terms of work and just life in general. And I remember, so this Friday, you know, I had planned to meet up with a friend we've been trying to get together for months on end. And I finally was able to, you know, we scheduled this out in advance, and we finally were able to go, and I didn't want to cancel because of things. And so, you know, I met with him, and what an odd dichotomy, you know, you have the state of the world, then like a joyous moment going to see someone who I admire and respect and was looking forward to seeing, and it was a great like lunch. And then he asked me, like, what are you doing after this? I was like, I'm basically going to a funeral. It's not a funeral, but it's just, you know, memorial and stuff like that for a friend's dad. And he's like, are you serious? I'm like, yeah. He's like, holy shit. And I was like, yeah, I mean, let's talk about the duality, the dichotomy of life, going from one extreme to the next extreme and so forth. And, this is what I mean about being able to process two things at once. And yeah, that was an interesting experience, and it's something that I'd gone through, so I was able, in the ways that I can, I'm able to help my friend process those emotions. Obviously each situation is ultimately different and each person is different. And so part of it is just knowing that there is no right way to process it. It's whatever is best for you. My recommendation is to not drown your sorrows in alcohol, or drugs or whatever. They're things that are not good for you. But ultimately, I also get why someone would do that. I'm not saying that that's what he's doing. I'm just saying in terms of the overall perspective. And yeah, like I said, what a high and low in terms of all of this. But it was in kind of all of that I was able to compartmentalize a lot of this and say, okay, I do have something to say right now that I think is worth saying to the world, and hence I'm doing this. And, one of the big things that I really thought about was, in many ways, we can't shun ourselves out to the goodness of the world, right? Certainly, if you look at just war in general, that's one of the aspects that the enemy wants, is for your spirit to be broken, for you to feel numb, right? And so what's worth fighting for? That has to be considered, right? Giving us something to strive for, to create optimism, to know that this is what we want. We're not just fighting against something, we're fighting for something. I think that's a big component of it, is we have to fight for something. And, in the case of Ukraine, they're fighting for their freedom. That's a, powerful thing. And in an odd way, one of the things I thought about was, and take this in the spirit of which I intend it, if the wording isn't, perfect, but, President Zelensky, by continuing to be out there in that way that he is, in an odd way, creates... Normalcy isn't the right term, but it shows a consistency. That in spite of everything, he's going to show up. And he's going to give it his all. Right? And it's not even apples and oranges, it's apples and cars. But that's why I'm going to choose to continue doing this, doing episodes, while I think I still have something to say, because at least I think it provides a consistency. I think for the amount that exists, we'll call it the audience, right? For the audience, aka you, that are out there that find some value in what I do, I think it would be, not to over hype it, but I could see, because I know from my experience, if there is something that I truly admire, and that brings me a sense of normalcy. Let's say South Park, right? South Park brings me a huge sense of normalcy. And, in this pandemic, whenever a South Park episode aired, I found it so cathartic, because it was the familiar. And so that I want to the extent that I can, provide that for you. I'm not saying, again, I'm not trying to overinflate my value in your life. But if there's any semblance that what I do add something for you, or just the fact that I'm doing it, then I think that's worthwhile. And that's why I do think art matters. I was speaking with someone close to me because, I was like, we were both trying to process things, and I was like, do I even work on the movie anymore? What? And it was like, no, this is why art matters and has always mattered. And it's not to say that it's the only thing that matters. As I talked about, activism must be a daily thing, and I try to be of benefit to the world every single day in the ways that I can. And likewise, my art tries to be that as well. So it's not a this or that, it's a this and that. And so, to the extent that I can, I've been continuing to work on my film. And, I as I told people on the team, I do think it has a place in this world. Perhaps now more than ever. What I haven't told them, and hopefully they're not listening, but I reserve the right to alter the ending a little bit. And not a lot. I don't even know what I would change it to. And then it wouldn't be like this drastic thing. And, my endings tend to be ironic in the sense that, it's not like a happy ending where everything's wrapped up in a bow and it's great, but it's also not sad. They tend to be like the real world. Both there's good and negative, right? And it's not to say that I want to change it towards one direction or the other, but just through minor tweaks of just readjusting maybe some dialogue, and the way something happens, and the epiphany or the climax of the film happens, maybe altering that just slightly, just subtle change to reflect upon, how I view the world now. But we'll see. I reserve that right. But even without that, I still think that the movie has a place in the world. And, just to kind of update you on what's been going on there. One of the things that I did was song spotting. So basically, I went through the entire movie and wrote out the time codes and the style and the sense of the music that should happen in those moments, right? So this is for my composers, and so they know the scenes that we've identified, the scenes that I want music in, and also what I'm looking for out of that. Just even stuff as basic as should it be upbeat or somber? And I'm not musically inclined, so it's tough for me to do those various things. It's not like I can say go F minor on this or whatever. But I tried to be as detailed as possible, so I would be like, okay, here's some reference songs. And by the way, I posted a little screenshot of a few of samples of the various spots of music in my Patreon. So if you're interested in that, patreon.com/Svitek. But, I would write out just the various, music examples of what I think could have worked if in an ideal world. And then at the same time be like, okay, at this part when someone's saying this, it should go a little bit quiet and subdued, and then really ramp up at this part, or whatever the case may be, right? Really trying to illustrate the picture as much as I can. And, luckily they found it beneficial, because I was like, I don't know if this is going to be, I spent a couple hours on it. I was like, I don't know if this is going to be a help at all, but I'm doing my best, and luckily it was. So there was that. The other aspect is, the movie was, the assembly edit was about 2 hours, and now I've gone through and, we're revising it, right? And so my ideal length is 95 minutes, and so what I've gone through is I broke the movie into 6 reels. 6 parts, right? Essentially, it just makes it easier to edit and the post-production process and all that. And based on the script, each reel, has a page count, and the page count, generally 1 page equals 1 minute of screen time, generally, right? So based on the page numbers of each section, I wrote out, okay, here's the ideal runtime. And then I looked at what the runtime per reel was based off of, the 2-hour version. And then I compared them, and, that gave me, okay, what am I shooting for? All right, in this reel, I got to cut out 4 minutes. In this reel, I got to cut out 3 minutes, whatever the case may be. In this reel, I got to cut out 6 minutes. And so what I've been doing is going reel by reel and tightening it up. And getting it to those ideal lengths. Now, I've yet to the closest I've gotten is within 25 seconds of the idea of what I'm at now versus the ideal. So we'll see. I have 2 more reels left to go through, and we'll see how that ends up being, and then we'll take it again, right, and kind of continue to finesse and finesse and finesse. And what's been nice, just naturally by this process, anything that was unclear before, any moments of awkwardness in the storytelling and whatever else, just by doing this, it automatically gets rid of like 95% of that. And this is why revision and trimming down is essential. It's, I think Neil Gaiman, maybe Stephen King, but I think Neil Gaiman, he says the first draft that you write, you just get it out there. And the second draft that you write, the purpose is to make it seem like you always knew what you were writing from the beginning. Paraphrasing, but that's the sentiment, right? And, so I think it is Neil Gaiman. And Stephen King has this idea that, you do the first draft and then you cut about 20%. Because, we just in general, right, just take writing. We tend to overwrite because we try to over-explain and so forth, when in reality it doesn't need any of that. And so, like all things, and this isn't a phenomenon to me. All movies do this, they have the script and they shoot it, and then it comes back in the assembly, and it runs a little bit long, and then it's like, okay, how do you get it down to a better length, so it plays. And it's not to say that like I'm just cutting stuff out. Some of it's just simple, trim this here, trim that, and whatever else, right? So it's small changes that actually add up to a lot. And then yes, of course, there are instances where, I've had to, so far, I'm being, on this pass, this is the beauty of like this sort of pass, is, I'm just being like totally like, all right, you know what, just take that out. Because of course I have it, and so if for some reason, if after this pass we watch it, and it's really missing that element, it's a lot easier to put back in. But I'd rather see like how much, in an ideal world, can I pare this down so I know what is missing versus, oh, that wasn't needed at all, right? So that's the goal of this. And it's going well, so I've got 2 more reels, and we'll go from there. Now, in speaking about this, someone asked me, like, oh wow, that's great that you're able to, work in that way. Because this was someone I was talking with and whatever. And, one of the things when you really consider, it's kind of a cheat for me, because I'm such a great editor, that's, tooting my own horn, but it's not really pure creation, it's just revision. The hard part was the assembly edit, that was the heavy lifting. And now I'm just finessing, right? So that's easy. Anyone, our natural critical minds gravitate towards this work anyway. It's creation that's hard, and the thing that I haven't been able to do is work on my book, nor have I kind of wanted to in some sense. It's just too exhausting for me at least, to create something completely from scratch. It's just a lot. It really is. And so, this revising the film in the edit stage, I can do that all day, any day. So One of the nice parts, Jonathan Moulton, who's worked on this movie with me, he called me on Sunday and we spoke, and it was great to hear him because it was the first time he actually watched the assembly edit, which is the 2-hour edit. But even still, like, he was full of praise, and obviously we talked notes and things like that, but it was just great. He was like, holy shit, it felt so good to watch it, like we really pulled it off. I was like, yeah, we did. And because, he's really proud of himself because he's never worked on a project of that magnitude. He's not worked on a feature film, right? And even for me, I'd worked on a feature film, my first one, right? But that one was essentially, it's 80 minutes, number one. So, it does make a huge difference of 80 minutes versus like even just 95. And the rough cut for that came in at like 91 minutes. This one came in at 2 hours, so a huge difference, right? But whereas that was kind of a lot of interweaving storylines. So it's like, in a way, it's like a series of short films within a whole, right? This is, you have to continue a narrative thread from start to finish. And that one we filmed over multiple weekends. So I had and the actors had breaks in between. Whereas this, we shot, we went to Colombia and we shot from start to finish. Not that we had like 16-hour days or anything like that. Generally, I think we had like 10 or 12-hour days. But still, like it's a lot, especially like the thing about it, it's not like you're going home and you're going back to an Airbnb with all these other people living on top of each other, So there's that aspect, and that'll be fun to kind of recount with everybody. But yeah, it's one of my trepidations with the assembly edit was, when are the wheels going to come off? Right? Like, it was going good, and I was like, at some point, like, oh my God. And because that was also, the majority of it I was cutting when we still hadn't finished principal photography. We had stuff to finish out and film in LA, and we hadn't. I was like, okay, what we have is great, but until we get this, we don't have a complete movie. So that was part of it, and then we shot it, and luckily I was able to get that stuff out quick in terms of editing it. And again, like all films, you have to clarify motives and things of that nature. Like, it's all a process, but the fact that on the whole it works is a true testament to everyone involved, and that's amazing. So it was great to catch up with Jonathan and be able to shoot the shit on that. So yeah, that's kind of the week in a nutshell. I wanted to end on something a little bit positive. I hope it doesn't seem selfish. Like I said, two things can be true at the same time. And so, yeah, I hope you're taking care of yourself, and at the same time helping in the ways that you can, that we continue to work on ourselves as well as work towards a better world, as hokey as that may be. Thank you for taking the time to tune in. I appreciate it, especially in this current state of the world. You didn't have to, so it means a lot to me. I hope you did benefit from this. As always, if there's anything you want to ask or give your thoughts on, comment down below, or hit me up on social media @Svitek. I appreciate you. Hope to see you next time.